Good morning. I thought since we've got all the table saws relocated, it would be a good time to have a table saw refresher so that when we come into the shop, we know which saw to go to cut the wood we need or to work on our workpiece. Right from Jump Street, table saw number 12, table saw number 13 are identical. Whatever you can cut on one of the table saws, you can cut on the other one. Table saw number 10 and table saw number 11 are also identical. Whatever you can cut on one, you can cut on the other. If you're just doing standard ripping of boards, you can do that on any of the four saws. However, saw number 10 and 11 are not identical to saw number 12 and 13. There are special cuts that can only be done on saw number 12, saw number 13, and special cuts that can only be done on saw number 10 and saw number 11. The crosscut sled that we have right here can be used on any of the four saws. On saw number 12 and 13, what you need to do is remove the guard, the anti-kickback dogs, and lower the riving knife. Do not take the riving knife off. Just to put it in a lower position and the sled will slide and clear the riving knife. Also, when you're using the crosscut sled, bring your blade up until the top carbide teeth clear your workpiece by about 1/8 of an inch to maybe 3/16 of an inch. It'll give you a cleaner cut and it'll make sure that the piece that you're cutting will cut all the way through. You just shove your sled up to the stop. When you're at the stop, your cut should be all the way through. You don't have to look to see if it's cut. It will be cut when you're at the stop. The old cliche, never say never, doesn't work for saw number 12 and saw number 13. If you look at the storyboard says, never remove the riving knife. Let's repeat that. Never remove the riving knife. 12 and 13 are the newer saws, and these saws have been engineered and equipped with a riving knife, which is nothing more than a fancy name for a splitter. And any cut that you make on 12 or 13 can be made with the riving knife in place. We never take it out of the saw. All the saws have the combination blade as the default blade for normal cutting. The combination blade will give you a series of teeth that are close together and every so often a gouger to keep the kerf clean. But this blade is the blade that we should use for probably 98% of the cutting that we do. So when you walk up to a table saw, it should have the combination blade on there already installed. If you need a different blade, a special blade for maybe some heavy ripping or some real fine hardwood cutting for fine work, then talk to the manager and ask him if he can get a blade out for you so that you can either put it on yourself or have someone who knows how to change the blades for you. Also, every once in a while you'll see members in here who use their own blades. Some of the members have very fine teeth, thin kerf blades for fine cutting that they put on the saw and then they take off when they're done so that they can handle the type of cutting that they need for their workpiece. 10 and 11 are the older saws. However, they can do anything that those two saws, the newer saws, can do as far as standard ripping. The thing that's different about 10 and 11 is 10 and 11 are the only saws in the shop where you can cut dados. Dados cannot be cut on 12 and 13. 10 and 11, either one. Cut your dados on either one. The thing to remember when you cut dados of course, is you have to remove the splitter. Unplug the saw, remove the splitter. When you're cutting dados, keep in mind your dado blade generally is not very far up from the table. And a lot of times what we've had in the past, your workpiece, if it skews, will slip right across the top of that dado blade. The dado blade will catch it and throw it across the room. So make sure when you're doing dado work that you are using a double feather board to hold your piece all the way through the cut so that this piece cannot kick out and get caught on the blade. So that's the process for cutting dados. Cutting rabbets, just a little bit different. Cutting rabbets, we have the sacrificial fence, where you will apply the sacrificial fence to the saw, like this. Using a dado blade, if you're cutting dado rabbets using a sacrificial fence, you always want to make your dado pack a little wider, because part of your dado pack is going to ride actually underneath the sacrificial fence. So if you want to cut a 1/2 inch rabbet, you want probably, I would say, 3/4 inch dado pack so that you can have enough dado blades to cut clear to the edge of your workpiece. We also have a new tenon jig to cut tenons. And this tenon jig will work on any of the 4 saws. What you'll need to do is remove the guard and lower the riving knife if you're using it on this saw or saw number 12. Tenoning jig is made to work to the left of the blade, okay? And then your tenon workpiece would be on the right, clamped in with the hand whip. But when you're using it on 12 and 13, you must remove the guard and the anti-kickback dogs and drop the riving knife to the lower position. And if you're using it on saw number 10 and 11, you may have to remove the splitter, okay, just like you would for cutting dados. Remove the splitter, just kind of put the guards up out of the way. Now keep in mind, when you're using the sled and you're using items like that where the guards need to be taken out of the way, you don't have to take them all out of the saw and lay them somewhere. Just take your guard like this and tilt it up and then tighten it back up, just so you have enough room for the sled to clear. That way your guard is always in place. When you're done cutting with your sled, you just loosen the screw and then put the guard back down to where it was before. That way you don't have to remove it, lay it somewhere, and then try to find the hole to put it back in when you're finished. Now you notice when you come up to saw number 10, we have a sled stop in just one slot. Actually, all of the table saws have a sled stop in only one slot. The reason for that is we don't have a sled stop over here on the other slot is because that is where the taper jig runs, and the taper jig has a longer track on it. So as we use the taper jig, which we did a coffee on it one time, you clamp your piece in here. After you measure out how far you want to cut your taper, you clamp your piece in with these clamps, and then you shove it through the saw. You leave the splitter on and shove it through the saw like this. But you notice how far up it goes before we clear the blade. That's why we don't have a stop on the right hand slot, okay? And that's for cutting tapers. So this is how you would set up the saw. It says saw number 10 only, but I believe you can use this on saw number 10 or 11. I wouldn't try the taper jig on saw number 12 or 13, although it probably would work too. But unless these other saws are tied up, saw number 10 and 11 are the ones that will give you a real accurate cut with the taper jig. This is an excellent jig if you're ever into tapering of any kind, table legs or just tapering a board. This is the jig you want to use. And That's the reason we don't have a stop on the right sides, because the taper jig requires a longer track. One other operational change on number 12 and 13 is we have a minimum width of rip of 1 inch. And the reason for that, we have it listed right here on the slide for the fence. 1 inch minimum is all you can rip on 12 and 13. And the reason for that is this. That is as close as you can bring the fence until you get to the guard. When you get to the guard, you're at 1 inch right there, and you're up against the guard. There's absolutely no room, even if you lift this up, to push your piece through. So we've made this a 1 inch minimum rip. That's important to remember. One other thing, and you're going to say, well, why don't you just take the guard off? And then you can get closer to it, and then you can rip smaller. The reason we don't allow you to do that is because if you get down into there like that, we have found that as you push your push stick through, the push stick happens to touch this button, it will release these anti-kickback dogs, and the anti-kickback dogs then will fall onto the blade. So that's why we never allow you to use this saw without the guard and the anti-kickback dogs in place when you're ripping. They both have to be in place because the guard protects this button that keeps the anti-kickback dogs from coming loose. While we're at it, let's say a few words about push tools. We have all kinds in the shop. Each of the table saws has one of these offset push tools. They're real nice because you can see your hand is offset on top of the fence and clearly away from the blade. We also have, if you're doing some resawing, this comes in handy with pushing your wood through the saw and keeps your hands plenty far away from the blade. It also has a little spring-loaded clip in the back here, so that if you're doing a long board, as you pull it back, when you get to the end of your board, that little foot drops down and allows you to push your piece all the way through. This is an excellent push tool. Then, of course, if you're working real close and you need a thinner push stick, these we make in the shop, and they're a little easier to get through here sometimes than some of the other ones. But always use push tools when you need them. And most of us only have 2 hands. I only know 2 or 3 people that have 3. The feather boards give us a 3rd hand. Use the feather boards whenever you can, because feather boards help you control your workpiece as it goes through the saw. Now you might say, well, I know there are times when you're cutting dados and you're using a big piece, a wide piece, and you can't put these feather boards on here like this. That's true. If you're cutting dados or rabbits and you don't have room for the feather board out here, then what you need to do is kind of stand to the side of the saw, and as you push your piece through with one hand, you keep it against the fence with the other, especially all the way through the cut, so that your piece doesn't skew out on you and then get caught in the blade and have the blade catch it and throw it. So if you have a bigger piece, can't use the feather boards, hold it yourself. And as you go through the saw, keep control of your workpiece all the way through. But if you have a hand out here on this corner, that's going to keep it from skewing into the blade as you go through the saw. Become familiar with the storyboards. The storyboards are the guild rules for that particular piece of equipment. The storyboards are very helpful to you if you're unsure of how to use the equipment, or if maybe you forgot. The storyboards are also helpful to the manager and the mentor, because they give the manager some support in case there's some controversy with certain cuts that are being made on the saw. So become familiar with the storyboards.